I picked up the phone that morning with a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. The sun filtered through the lace curtains of my living room, casting little patterns on the rug. My lilac dress hung in the closet upstairs, still pressed from the dry cleaners, waiting for the date my daughter had promised to set. The shoes I had bought, sensible but elegant, were still wrapped in tissue. I was ready. Or so I thought. When Leora answered, her voice was too bright, almost sing-song. "Mom," she said as if the word itself were a chore. I asked the question I had rehearsed in my head. "Sweetheart, when is the wedding? I need to know the date so I can prepare." There was a pause, a faint rustling on the other end of the line. Then, with a calm that froze me in place, she said, "We got married yesterday. It was only for special people." I gripped the receiver so hard I thought it might snap. Special people. The phrase dripped with a cruelty I didn't recognize in my own child. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in, as if to remind me of all the years I had bent myself to fit her needs. I didn't respond right away. What words could I offer to a daughter who had just announced she'd erased me from her most important day? My mouth went dry. She cleared her throat, then added, "It was intimate. Just a few people. You understand." And then she hung up. The line went dead, but the words echoed in my head. Special people. I sank into the old armchair, the one I had upholstered myself after Robert passed, and stared at the family photos on the wall. Leora as a child, her hand tucked in mine, eyes wide with trust. The girl who once clung to me when nightmares woke her. Where had she gone? I told myself to breathe. I told myself there had to be an explanation, some mix-up, but my fingers betrayed me, reaching for the phone again, not to call, but to scroll. One search, and the lie unraveled. There they were, dozens of photographs already making their rounds on social media. Leora radiant in a lace gown that cost more than I dared to spend on myself in a year. Ewan in a fitted tuxedo grinning beside her. His parents raising champagne glasses, her cousins dancing under strings of lights. The backdrop was unmistakable, the Riverview banquet hall with its grand chandeliers and river-facing windows. I knew that place. I knew it because I had written the check to hold the date nearly 6 months ago, thinking I was doing my part to secure her dream wedding. I remembered how she smiled, then slipping the receipt into her purse as if it were a harmless piece of paper. My money had paid for the night that erased me. I felt my stomach twist, not just from betrayal, but from the humiliating precision of it. Every dollar I had sacrificed, every weekend meal I had, pared down to beans and rice, every trip I hadn't taken, every sweater I hadn't bought, had gone into a celebration I was never meant to see. The lilac dress upstairs became a cruel joke. The shoes, an absurd reminder. I rose, walked to the closet, and opened the door. There it hung, soft fabric brushing against my fingers. I had imagined standing in that dress beside my daughter, proud and trembling, watching her begin a new life. Now it was just another bill unpaid, another fantasy unraveled. I closed the closet door, my hand steady in a way my heart wasn't. Somewhere deep inside, something colder than sorrow stirred, something I hadn't felt in years. And as I sat back down staring at the silence of my phone, I knew this was only the beginning of a reckoning. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Riverview chandeliers glowing over tables I had unknowingly paid for each crystal drop, mocking my absence. I got up before dawn, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my checkbook. The numbers blurred, but the story they told was crystal clear. $700, every month without fail. That was the rent I had covered for them. At first, Leora said it was temporary, just until Ewan settled into his new job. That was 3 years ago. The temporary had become a habit, one I honored as though it were holy. Then came the extras. The unexpected expenses that always arrived like clockwork. $2,000 for the car repair when their second-hand Subaru broke down on I-5. $800 for a dental bill Ewan said insurance wouldn't cover. $200 here, $500 there, groceries, prescriptions, new tires, a down payment on a couch. I had stopped adding it up long ago, convincing myself it didn't matter. But in truth, I didn't want to see the total. I thought of the little trips I'd given up weekends in the Columbia Gorge with my book club. The art exhibit in Seattle my sister Diana had begged me to join her for. Each time I said no because the kids needed help. Each time I told myself their future mattered more than my present. Ewan had always been careful not to ask directly. He was polite, smooth, even charming on the surface, but he never looked me straight in the eye. When bills piled up, he'd drift out of the room, leaving Leora to soften me. She was clever with words, careful with her timing. "Mom, you always know what to do," she'd say, voice trembling just enough. And I, foolish with hope, would write another check. I remembered one Saturday at the Portland Farmers Market. The air was sweet with strawberries and fresh basil, the kind of day that used to make Robert and me linger for hours. I had gone with $20 set aside for myself. I had planned to buy a bouquet of dahlias, a little indulgence to brighten the house. But as I wandered past the stalls, my phone buzzed. A text from Leora, "Mom, we're short this week. Could you help us with groceries?" Just a couple hundred would get us through. I remember staring at the message, the dahlias, a blaze of red and gold in my hand. I put them back down, walked to the bank, and transferred the money instead. I went home empty-handed, telling myself flowers wilt, but love lasts. Except love hadn't lasted. It had been replaced by entitlement, dressed in silk and lace, toasted with champagne, in a hall that still carried the faintest echo of my checkbook. The ache that spread through me wasn't just about being excluded from a wedding. It was the realization that every dollar I had given, every plan I had canceled, every dream I had postponed, had been building a life that had no room for me. The receipts of love lay scattered across years, each one a small surrender I had disguised as generosity. And now I couldn't help but wonder if I had been financing not their happiness, but my own disappearance. As I closed the checkbook, the silence of the house pressed harder than ever, and I understood that the next step would not be theirs. It had to be mine. 2 days after tallying the numbers in my checkbook, I drove into the Pearl District. The streets were lined with polished storefronts and coffee shops, all glass and steel, the kind of neighborhood Robert and I used to avoid because the parking was impossible. But it was where Leora and Ewan lived now, in a loft apartment that looked down on a wine bar I could never afford to step into. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hands gripping the rail harder than necessary. When the door opened, it was Leora who greeted me. She was dressed like someone expecting company, hair-pinned silk blouse tucked neatly into tailored trousers. "Mom," she said, her smile stretched too thin. "You didn't have to come all the way out here." Inside, the loft gleamed. High ceilings, brick walls, scrubbed, spotless furniture, arranged as if a magazine spread had dictated it. The rug underfoot was one I recognized. I had paid for it after Leora complained the floor was too cold. My eyes swept across the room and landed on the gallery wall above the sofa. There they were, framed photographs from the wedding. Leora in a lace gown that clung like it had been sewn to her body, the price tag of $4,000. Plain in my memory. Ewan beside her, his tuxedo sharp, his arm claiming her as though she were a prize. Around them stood his parents in their tailored finery, champagne flutes, raised smiles wide. Her cousins, her friends, even distant relatives I barely knew, all immortalized in glossy prints. But not me. Not a single image, not even the suggestion that I had ever existed. I walked closer, as if proximity might change the truth. One photo showed the newlyweds cutting a cake 3 tiers tall, draped in sugar flowers. Another captured Ewan's father, giving a toast, his hand raised high. In each, I saw fragments of what I had paid for the deposit on the hall, the down payment on the dress, the endless little extras I had funded without knowing. And then I saw the chair. It sat in the corner, upholstered in a muted green fabric I had picked with care. Leora had once told me, "Mom, this will be the first real piece of furniture we own, not just hand-me-downs." I had driven across town to deliver it myself, scraping my knuckles on the doorframe to wedge it through. Now it stood in their pristine living room, holding nothing of me except the memory of sweat and scraped skin. Ewan emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 glasses of water. He placed them on the coffee table without meeting my gaze. His eyes darted past me as if I were a guest he hoped would leave quickly. "How are you, Mrs. Calder?" he asked, his voice flat. Mrs. Calder. Not Mom. Not even Renata. I opened my mouth, but Leora spoke first, perching on the sofa like a queen addressing her subject. "We kept it small," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the photos. "It felt right. Intimate. We didn't want a big spectacle." I looked at her. My own daughter. Her posture regal. Her tone rehearsed. "It doesn't look small." I murmured, my eyes still on the photos. Her smile faltered, but only for a second. "It was for the people who've been closest lately. You understand?" I didn't. Or maybe I understood too well. I set my bag down on the floor, my fingers brushing the chair I had delivered. The fabric was cool, the cushion untouched. The silence grew heavy. Ewan excused himself back into the kitchen. Leora smoothed her blouse, poured herself into her role, as though nothing had been lost, as though my absence in those photographs was natural. I sat on their sofa, cold beneath me, despite its expensive fabric, and realized for the first time that I was no longer a mother in her story. I was an outsider, a sponsor, a shadow. And as I rose to leave, my eyes landed once more on the wall of frames, their glass shining under the loft's perfect light. Not one of them bore my reflection. I walked out with a weight in my chest, knowing that the next call from Leora would not be about love, but about money. It was exactly a week later when the phone rang. I had been in the garden pruning the roses that Robert planted years ago, their thorny branches reminding me that beauty and pain were often bound together. The ringtone startled me, not because I wasn't expecting it, but because deep down, I already knew who it would be. Mom Leora's voice poured through the line, syrupy sweet, like she'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror. "I was just thinking about you." I closed my eyes. That was her opening move, always starting with warmth before delivering the ask. I let the silence stretch until she grew uncomfortable, until she had to fill it. "The rent's overdue," she said finally, the edge of tension slipping through the sugar. "Ewan thought, maybe you'd already transferred it, but we don't see it in the account yet. Did something happen?" My hand tightened around the shears I was holding. I could hear the faint clink of glasses behind her voice, maybe dishes being stacked in their pristine kitchen. They were living surrounded by my money. Yet here she was, again asking for more as if it were her birthright. I drew in a breath, steady and slow, as if I were preparing to cut a final stem. "Leora," I said, my voice calm. "Didn't I tell you? I only help special people." The words fell heavy, and the silence that followed was like a chasm opening between us. I could hear her breathing, quick and uneven. For the first time, she didn't have a response ready. "Mom? What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice sharper, now stripped of its false sweetness. I walked toward the porch, letting the late afternoon light spill over me. "It means exactly what it sounds like I said. Special people. And you made it very clear last week that I am not one of them." Her gasp crackled through the line. "That's not fair. You're twisting things. We just wanted something small, that's all." I could have reminded her of the banquet hall, the chandeliers, the champagne flutes. I could have described each photo I had seen the proof of my exclusion hanging on her walls, but I didn't. I was done reciting evidence to someone who had already judged me unnecessary. "Leora," I said, and my voice surprised me with its steadiness. "You'll have to figure this one out on your own." The silence stretched again, but this time I felt no urge to fill it. Finally, she muttered, "Fine," and hung up. I set the phone on the table beside me and stared at it as if it were a stranger I no longer trusted. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with something fiercer, an anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about every deposit, every canceled plan, every bouquet I hadn't bought for myself, so I could keep her fridge full. The roses outside swayed gently in the evening air, their petals bruised but still clinging to life. I thought of the bouquet I had once put back at the farmer's market, choosing her hunger over my joy. Now I realized I had been starving in ways that money couldn't measure. When I went inside, I poured myself a glass of water, my throat dry but my heart strangely light. It was the first time I had said no, the first time I had let the silence speak for me. And though I knew she would call again, though I knew this battle wasn't finished, I also knew something had shifted. I had drawn a line, and this time, I intended to keep it. I turned off the phone, set it face down, and walked to the desk where my checkbook lay waiting. The numbers I was about to write would no longer be for her. They would be for me. That night, I sat at my dining table with my checkbook spread out like a crime scene. Piles of receipts, carbon copies of transfers, scribbled notes, reminding me which bill I had paid for them, in which month. All of it stared back like a timeline of my own disappearance. I picked up a pen and began to add. $700 a month for rent, 36 months straight. $18,600. Groceries often $200 a month on top of what I already spent to feed myself. $7,200. Birthday gifts, Christmas gifts, wedding deposits, the loan for their car, the doctor's visits, the air conditioner they said broke down in the middle of summer. Piece by piece, it all stacked higher. The final number stared up at me in my shaky handwriting. $33,400. My breath caught. $33,000. Money Robert had left to keep me safe in old age. Money I had saved from decades of teaching, scraping pennies, watching him work double shifts so we'd never lack. Money that was supposed to give me peace now, gone into the bottomless pit of Leora and Ewan's emergencies. The tears came, but they were not soft or sorrowful. They burned. They scalded my cheeks, my throat, my chest. These weren't the tears of a mother aching for closeness. They were the tears of a woman betrayed, used, and discarded. I pressed my palms flat on the table until the wood grain imprinted into my skin. Something inside me shifted. Grief was giving way to anger, and anger was giving me something I hadn't felt in years, strength. The next morning, I dressed carefully, almost ceremonially, as though I were walking into battle. I drove to the bank where I had walked in month after month to make transfers for Leora. The teller greeted me warmly, but this time, I asked to see Mr. Klein. He had been there for years, a steady presence behind his desk, always polite and efficient. When I walked in, he stood up surprised. "Mrs. Calder," he said, smiling. "It's been a while since you've come to see me directly. What can I do for you?" I sat down, my purse heavy on my lap. "I want to cancel all automatic transfers to my daughter's account," I said. My voice didn't tremble. His brows lifted slightly, though he remained professional. "All of them. You've had those scheduled for quite some time." "Yes," I said. "Every last one." He hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice as though he were confiding in me. "Forgive me if this is out of place, but are you sure this is what you want? You've been very consistent in supporting them." For a second, I almost faltered, but then I remembered the banquet hall, the photographs, the words "only special people." I straightened my shoulders. "I'm sure. Something softened in his expression. Then I'll take care of it right now. As he typed into his computer, I studied his face. There was genuine concern. More concern than my own daughter had shown me in years. When he finished, he slid the confirmation papers across the desk. It's done. You'll have no further transfers to their account. I picked up the pen and signed my signature firm. For the first time, it felt like I was writing my name for myself, not for them. When I looked up, Mr. Klein was watching me with an expression I hadn't expected. Respect. Mrs. Calder, he said gently, I've seen people come in here for decades. Parents, grandparents, spouses. I know when someone is being pressured, and I just want you to know it's not selfish to protect what you've worked for. It's necessary. The words struck something deep in me, something I hadn't known I needed to hear. I nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you, I whispered. I walked out of the bank lighter than I had felt in years, the papers clutched in my hand like a shield. The sun caught on the glass doors as they closed behind me, and I thought, this is what it feels like to reclaim your own life. But even as I started the car, I knew Leora would notice soon enough, and when she did, she would not stay silent. The papers from the bank were still tucked safely in my purse when I made the next call. It wasn't to Leora, and it wasn't to anyone in my family. It was to a locksmith. By the time the truck pulled into my driveway, the late afternoon sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across my roses. I watched from the porch as a young man in overalls stepped out carrying his tool bag. He looked barely older than my grandson would have been if I had one. Afternoon, ma'am, he said cheerfully. What can I do for you? I want all the locks changed, I told him. Front, back, and garage, everyone. He nodded already, jotting notes on a clipboard. Lost your keys? I hesitated, then shook my head. No. I just don't want certain people using the copies they have. He didn't ask more, just set to work. Metal clinked against metal, the steady rhythm of his tools oddly comforting. I stood by arms crossed, watching each lock surrender and give way to something new. Halfway through, he came back to me holding a small bundle in his hand. 4 keys, all identical. These were in your lockbox, he said. Puzzled. Usually, people keep just 1 or 2 spares, but these look like they've been duplicated a few times. My breath caught. I hadn't made those. I had given Leora a single spare years ago, thinking only of emergencies if I ever fell, if I ever locked myself out. Somehow, one had become 4. My stomach turned cold. They've been copied, I murmured. The locksmith nodded. Yeah, and not too long ago, judging by the shine. Whoever did it wanted plenty of access. I thanked him quietly, though the words felt hollow. When he left, I stood on my porch, staring at those extra keys in my hand, their edges sharp against my palm. My daughter hadn't just locked me out of her wedding. She had ensured she could walk into my house whenever she pleased. Not protection, possession. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard the crunch of gravel under shoes. My neighbor, Eleanor Brooks, came up the path, balancing a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. She was 70, with silver hair that caught the last rays of sun like spun glass. Renata, she called softly. I baked too many cookies again. Thought you might help me keep from eating them all? I forced a smile and invited her to sit with me on the porch. The roses leaned over us, their shadows long and soft. Eleanor set the basket between us, the smell of cinnamon and sugar rising like comfort itself. You've had men working here all afternoon, she said, tilting her head toward the door. Something wrong with the locks, I hesitated, then sighed. Not wrong. Just overused. I found out my daughter made extra keys. More than I ever gave her. Eleanor's expression tightened, sympathy flickering in her eyes. Ah, she said simply, as though she knew the weight of that discovery without me having to explain. She broke a cookie in half and passed it to me. My son did the same once. He thought my house was his storage unit. Came and went when he pleased. Took food, took money from the jar I kept in the kitchen. Took my peace, too. I looked at her, startled. What did you do? She smiled faintly, though her eyes were wet. I changed the locks. And then I stopped apologizing for having a life of my own. We sat in silence for a long moment, the cookies warm in our hands, the air cooling around us. For the first time in days, I didn't feel like I was unraveling alone. Eleanor understood in a way no one else could. When the streetlights flickered on, I walked her back down the path, the basket now lighter. At the gate, she squeezed my hand. "Don't let them turn your house into theirs," she whispered. After she left, I stood alone on the porch, staring at the new locks glinting in the shadows. The keys felt heavy in my pocket, but heavier still was the knowledge that my daughter might not take this quietly. And as I stepped inside and turned the bolt for the first time, I knew the next knock at my door would not come with cookies. It was only 3 days after the locksmith left when the pounding came at my door. Not a polite knock, not the ring of the bell, but fists striking wood with the rhythm of anger. I peeked through the side window and saw Leora's face red with fury, Ewan looming behind her like a shadow. "Mom, open up." Leora called, her voice tight, shaking. "This is ridiculous." I opened the door just wide enough to step into the threshold, but not enough to invite them inside. My hand rested on the frame, steadying myself as much as it blocked their entry. "You changed the locks?" She snapped, eyes darting to the shiny new deadbolt. "Why would you do that? We've always had keys. It's dangerous for you to be alone like this." "I prefer it this way," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. Ewan leaned forward, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. "Renata, you're making decisions that don't make sense. This isn't like you. First the transfers, now the locks. It feels paranoid, confused." The words slid into me like a blade. Confused. They were planting the seeds, softening the ground for something worse. "I'm not confused," I said evenly. "I'm clear for the first time in years." Leora's hands flew up. "Clear? You think shutting us out is clear? You think isolating yourself, turning us into enemies is clarity? This isn't you, Mom. It's something else. Maybe stress, maybe your age. We're worried about you. The performance might have worked on someone else, but I knew her too well." The cracks showed in the quick glance she threw at Ewan, in the slight tremor of her lip, when she realized I wasn't bending. "You'll have to stop worrying," I said. "I'm fine." I tried to close the door, but Ewan's hand pressed against it, not shoving, but firm enough to let me know he could. His voice was lower, measured, carrying something sharper than concern. "We'll make sure you're safe one way or another." I looked at him fully, then really looked. He wasn't the son-in-law I had once tried to believe would care for my daughter, or even tolerate me. His eyes were cold, calculating, as if my life was an equation, and he was already doing the math. I stepped back only enough to put space between us, my hand still on the door. "That sounded like a threat," I said. He gave a half smile, one that never touched his eyes. "No, of course not. We love you. We just can't stand by while you make dangerous choices." Dangerous, confused, paranoid. The vocabulary was already forming a script they were rehearsing in front of me. "Go home," I said quietly. "Whatever safety I need, I can handle." Leora's face contorted, her voice breaking from sweetness into raw anger. "You're pushing us away, Mom. Don't come crying to us when you need help." She turned sharply, heels striking the porch like hammers. Ewan followed, but not before giving me one last look, his hand tapping twice against the railing, as if marking his territory. I shut the door, locked it, and leaned against it, my chest tight. The silence inside the house was deafening, but beneath it ran a current of something darker. Their concern wasn't love. It was control dressed in soft words, but delivered with hard fists on my door. I walked through the living room to the window and watched them climb into their car. Leora was talking fast, gesturing sharply, and Ewan just nodded, already looking at me through the windshield. When the engine started, it roared louder than it needed to a parting shot. As the car pulled away, I felt the weight of what had just happened. They would not let this go. They would return, and next time, they wouldn't just come with accusations. I turned from the window, the echo of Ewan's words still in my ears one way or another, and I knew they were already planning their next move. The knock this time was different. Not the fists of anger, not the sharp pounding of accusation. It was measured, official. I hesitated before opening the door, already sensing this wasn't a neighbor with cookies or a delivery left at the wrong address. A woman in a navy blazer stood on my porch, a leather folder tucked under her arm. Her hair was neat, her expression rehearsed into something between concern and authority. "Mrs. Calder," she asked, holding out a badge. "I'm Mrs. Schmidt, a social worker with Multnomah County. May I come in for a wellness check?" The words landed heavy. I stepped back slightly, but kept the door only half open. "A wellness check." She nodded. "We received a report from concerned family members. They're worried about your mental well-being. They say you've been isolating yourself, displaying paranoia, and making unusual financial decisions." Her eyes flicked to the new locks behind me. "For example, installing unnecessary security systems." My stomach clenched. The script Leora and Ewan had rehearsed on my porch was now typed into a report. "I am fine," I said firmly. "I don't need a wellness check." Mrs. Schmidt softened her voice. "Ma'am, this isn't meant to be intrusive. It's standard when family expresses concern. If you'll allow me, we can just talk a little. It will help me close the case." I felt the air tighten around me. If I refused, it would look suspicious. If I let her in, it would give them ground. My hand hovered on the doorframe, torn. And then I remembered Mr. Weber's card sitting by the phone. Without a word, I picked it up and dialed. Within 20 minutes, he was standing beside me in my entryway, his presence steady as a wall. A tall man in his 60s, his gray suit slightly wrinkled, but his eyes sharp. He greeted Mrs. Schmidt politely, but with unmistakable authority. "My client is under my legal representation," he said, showing his credentials as though he had rehearsed this moment his entire life. "Any questions will go through me, and I'd like to see the report that initiated this visit." "Mrs." Schmidt hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. She opened her folder, flipping through papers. I caught a glimpse of phrases in quotation marks: irrational spending, paranoia about family, isolating behaviors. My chest tightened with both rage and recognition. Mr. Weber read quickly, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Schmidt, with respect, what you have here is a list of manipulative claims. My client has kept immaculate financial records. She has canceled voluntary transfers, nothing more. She is of sound mind and body. Installing new locks after discovering multiple unauthorized copies is not paranoia, it's prudence." Schmidt shifted uncomfortably. "I can only follow up on reports, sir. I don't decide what's submitted." "Then I suggest you consider who benefits from painting a competent woman as incompetent," Weber replied. His voice was calm, but there was an edge that left no room for doubt. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock in my hallway. Schmidt's eyes flicked between us, the certainty in her posture faltering. At last, she closed her folder. "I see no indication at this time that further action is required. I'll mark this visit complete." When she left, the air in the house seemed to release all at once. I sank into my chair, the adrenaline finally catching up with me. Mr. Weber placed a hand on the folder she had left behind, his expression grim. "They won't stop here," he said quietly. "This was just a first probe. They're testing how far they can push." I nodded, my throat dry, because I already knew he was right. And as I looked at the stack of canceled checks still on my desk, I knew the next battle would not be fought at my door, but in places far colder and more formal. After Mrs. Schmidt left and Mr. Weber's words settled into my bones, I found myself restless, pacing the house like a caged bird. The silence was too sharp, every tick of the clock sounding like a countdown to the next assault. I needed air, but more than that, I needed Robert. It had been months since I'd gone to his grave, too many excuses piled on top of one another. Leora needed me here, Ewan needed help. There, transfers to make, calls to take. My grief had been delayed, postponed in service of their endless demands. But now, after being accused of paranoia and incompetence, I craved the stillness of the man who had once steadied me. The Greenwood Cemetery lay just outside Portland, a rolling meadow dotted with marble stones and tall pines that whispered when the wind moved through them. I drove there on a gray morning, the clouds hanging low like unspoken words. Robert's headstone was simple, just as he'd wanted. His name, his years, and a line I'd chosen, beloved husband, steady heart. I knelt in the damp grass, brushing away the fallen pine needles. My reflection in the polished granite startled me. The lines on my face seemed deeper, my eyes harder than the woman who had once stood here in widow's black, full of tears, but not yet empty of hope. "I've lost her, Robert," I whispered. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe piece by piece, maybe all at once. But she looks at me now and sees nothing but a purse to open a door to walk through. And I let it happen." The meadow was quiet, the stillness both comfort and accusation. I stayed there longer than I meant to, speaking to him, as though he could answer, as though the earth could give me back a fragment of the man who had always told me the truth, even when it hurt. When I finally rose to leave, brushing the damp from my knees, a voice called behind me, "Mrs. Calder." I turned to see a man in a groundskeeper's jacket approaching a clipboard tucked under his arm. He was older, with thinning hair, and the kind of polite smile that comes from years of working with the grieving. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "We've been trying to get in touch with you about some paperwork. It concerns your late husband's life insurance policy." My stomach tightened. "His policy that was settled years ago. It's what I've been living on." He frowned slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm aware, but there's been some activity. A lien was placed against it as collateral for a personal loan. I assumed you knew. For a moment I thought I hadn't heard him right. A lien, by whom he checked the clipboard. It was authorized under your daughter's name, Leora Calder. The documents list her as having power of attorney." The ground seemed to tilt beneath me. "That's impossible. I never gave her power of attorney." The man's face softened with unease. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. All I know is what's on file. The loan company submitted the paperwork here when they filed the claim. I thought you were aware." I thanked him, though my voice was brittle, and walked back toward the car with my knees trembling. Each step felt heavier, as though Robert himself were pressing the weight of this betrayal onto my shoulders. Leora hadn't just excluded me from her wedding. She hadn't just drained my savings through endless requests. She had reached into the past, into the sanctuary of my husband's love, and stolen from it. She had signed her name where mine should have been used, his death, as leverage for her comfort, and left me ignorant of it all. By the time I slid behind the wheel, tears blurred the windshield. But these weren't the tears of a broken woman. They were sharper, fueled by a rage that felt cold and new. Robert's memory was sacred. To have it pawned away without my consent was more than betrayal. It was desecration. I gripped the steering wheel and stared at the cemetery gates until my vision cleared. Whatever love I had been clinging to, whatever foolish hope that my daughter might turn back toward me, was gone. She had taken my money, my trust, and now even my memories. And as I turned the ignition, I knew the next call I made would not be to Leora. It would be to Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber's office smelled faintly of leather and dust, like secrets carefully stored and only brought out when necessary. The shelves behind his desk were lined with heavy volumes of law, their spines cracked from years of use. I sat across from him, my hands folded tightly in my lap, as though if I loosened them, everything I had been holding together would spill out. He had already read the cemetery report I brought and listened in silence as I explained what the groundskeeper told me. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. Fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Mrs. Calder," he said slowly, "this isn't just a matter of betrayal anymore. What your daughter did using your late husband's life insurance as collateral suggests fraud. At the very least, it is a misuse of authority. But more importantly, it tells us they won't stop until they've stripped you of everything you have." The words should have broken me. Instead, they felt like confirmation of what I already knew. I nodded. "Waiting. You need shields," he continued. "Paper ones. They may not comfort the heart, but they will protect your assets. First, we will secure all accounts. That means closing those Leora and Ewan know about and opening new ones at a different institution. Second, we will adjust your will, removing any direct inheritance that might tempt further interference. Instead, you can designate charitable beneficiaries or a trust that cannot be manipulated. And third, I strongly recommend appointing a neutral fiduciary, a professional trustee, so there is no avenue for them to argue that you are incapable of managing your own affairs." The list was cold, clinical, but each item landed like a stone stacked into a wall. For the first time in months, I felt that wall rising around me, not as a prison, but as protection. "Will it stop them?" I asked quietly. "It will slow them," he said honestly. "And it will make their path harder if they attempt legal action against you. But understand, they may escalate. What they've tried already suggests desperation. They might attempt to claim you're incompetent, that you need guardianship, which is why these paper shields are essential. They speak louder than accusations." I closed my eyes briefly. Paper against blood. Contracts against the voices of my own child. The imbalance felt cruel, but at least it gave me something to stand behind. "I'll do it," I said, opening my eyes again. He smiled faintly, not of triumph, but of solidarity. "Good. We'll begin today." For the next 2 hours, I signed documents. Account closures, transfer authorizations, drafts of amendments to my will. Mr. Weber explained each one carefully, pausing to answer questions. His tone never rushed. My signature filled page after page, the ink drying into lines that felt less like surrender and more like reclamation. By the time he gathered the papers into neat stacks, I was exhausted. My back ached from sitting, my hand cramped from signing, but beneath the fatigue was something sturdier. Resolve. "You've taken the first real step," he said, sliding the final copy of the will toward me. "This document doesn't erase the pain, but it ensures that from this day forward, your choices are your own, no one else's." I touched the paper lightly, almost reverently. It wasn't love, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was control. A shield thin as it might be between me and the storm that was coming. When I left his office, the autumn air hit me sharp and cool, clearing my head. The city bustled around me, indifferent, while I held my purse close with the papers inside. For years, my money had been theirs before it ever touched my hands. Now, for the first time, it was mine again. But as I walked to my car, I knew Leora would not see it that way. She would see loss, she would see defiance, and she would not let it rest. The summons arrived in a plain white envelope, as though it carried nothing more than a bill. Inside, the words were colder than any debt collector could write, "Petition for guardianship." Leora and Ewan were asking the court to declare me incapable of managing my own affairs. My own daughter wanted to become my keeper. When the day came, I walked up the stone steps of the Multnomah County Courthouse with Mr. Weber at my side. The columns loomed above me, their weight pressing down like judgment itself. I had taught literature for decades, quoting lines about justice and truth, but nothing prepared me for the cruelty of seeing my name written as though I were a problem to be solved. Inside the courtroom, Leora sat with Ewan, their lawyer, polished and practiced. She wore a dark dress hair pulled back severely, as if mourning a mother not yet dead. Ewan avoided my eyes, busy arranging papers he probably didn't understand. The judge entered a man with weary eyes, who had seen too many families split by greed and grief. He called the case, and suddenly, my life became an exhibit. Leora testified first. Her voice wavered carefully, pitched between sorrow and concern. Your Honor, my mother has changed drastically over the past year. She isolates herself. She refuses to answer calls. She's paranoid, installing locks and cameras everywhere. And she's made reckless financial decisions that put her security at risk. We just want to help her. I watched her, my daughter, shaping lies into a net. I wanted to stand and shout to tell the court about the banquet hall and the stolen insurance. But Weber placed a steadying hand on my arm. Then came the witnesses. Mr. Davis, the neighbor across the street, took the stand. He had always resented my guests parking near his curb. Now he leaned forward eagerly, enjoying his moment. She yells at people in the street, he said. She acts like folks are out to get her. It's not normal. I've seen her talking to herself in the yard. He didn't mention that I had been on the phone, or that I raised my voice only when Leora and Ewan threatened me. Then Mr. Green, the pharmacist. My heart sank as he swore to tell the truth. She buys vitamins, aspirin, nothing else, he said. She refuses regular medical prescriptions. It's erratic behavior for someone her age. I clenched my hands in my lap. He had been tricked, I knew it. He didn't understand what his words would become once written into the record. Finally, their lawyer presented the most vicious piece, a psychiatric report signed and stamped, claiming I was showing signs of progressive cognitive decline. I had never met the doctor whose name appeared at the bottom. A stranger had diagnosed me unfit, all to give my daughter the keys to my life. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, Weber rose. Your Honor, we will respond in full. But I ask you to note that the petitioner's evidence relies entirely on hearsay, hostile neighbors, and fabricated reports. We will present verified documentation that Mrs. Calder is of sound mind and perfectly capable of managing her affairs. I sat silent, my heart hammering, while the lies floated like smoke above me. Leora dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, the picture of a grieving daughter. Ewan leaned back smug, as though the verdict were already written. But I caught the judge glancing at me, studying my posture, my clear gaze, the way I followed every word. He saw me. Not a patient, not a burden, but a woman fighting to keep what was hers. The hearing adjourned for the day, and as we rose, Weber whispered, "They've overplayed their hand. Now it's our turn." I walked out of the courthouse, the autumn wind cutting across my face, and knew the next round would decide more than money. It would decide whether truth had any place left in my own family. The next day, the courtroom felt colder, though the same pale light streamed through the tall windows. I sat straighter in my chair. The papers Mr. Weber had prepared stacked neatly before us. If yesterday had been theirs, today would be ours. Leora returned to the stand. Her dark dress unchanged, her voice carefully trembling. But Weber rose slowly, his glasses perched low on his nose, and the tremor in her performance began to fray. "Mrs. Calder," he began, his voice measured. "When was the last time you called your mother without asking for money?" She blinked. "We spoke all the time." He cut in smoothly. "Yes or no, please. When was the last call without a request for financial assistance?" Her lips parted, then closed again. The silence stretched, until the judge leaned forward. "I don't recall," she muttered finally. "Not once in the last 3 years," Weber pressed. She shifted in her seat. "We had other things to talk about." He held her gaze. "And yet every bank record, every text message we've submitted shows a request for funds, rent, groceries, car payments, medical bills. Would you like me to read them aloud?" Her lawyer objected, but the judge waved it aside. Leora's face tightened, the composure of yesterday slipping. Then Ewan was called. He walked with the bravado of a man convinced the law was on his side. But under Weber's questions, that confidence cracked. "Mr. Thatcher," Weber said evenly, "did you and your wife enter Mrs. Calder's home without her permission?" Ewan straightened. "We were worried. We thought she was confused, so we went to check on her." "So you broke in?" Weber countered. "It wasn't breaking in. We had keys." Weber lifted a document. Multiple duplicate keys were made without Mrs. Calder's knowledge. Does that sound like concern or control? Ewan's jaw worked, but no words came. The judge scribbled something on his notepad. When it was my turn, I rose with my records clutched tight. My hand trembled only once as I swore the oath. Weber guided me carefully, letting me tell my story, not in emotion, but in fact. I laid out the checkbooks, the transfers, the receipts, each one pristine and numbered. The total, 33,400, spoke louder than my voice ever could. Then came the evaluation. Dr. Moore, the independent psychiatrist, testified clearly. Mrs. Calder underwent cognitive testing last week. Her memory, reasoning, and financial judgment all scored above average for her age group. There is no medical basis to declare her incompetent. I met the judge's eyes then, and for the first time I felt seen not as a case but as a person. Finally, Weber held up a transcript. "Mrs. Calder, when you asked about your daughter's wedding, what did she tell you?" I swallowed the words, still bitter. She said, "We got married yesterday. Only special people were invited." The phrase hung in the air. Even the clerk paused, his pen hovering above paper. Weber let the silence stretch. Special people, excluding her own mother, who had funded much of their life for years. The judge's expression shifted, not anger, but a kind of quiet disturbance, as though a line had been crossed that even the law recognized as cruelty. I stepped down, my knees weak, but my heart steadier. Evidence had spoken louder than lies. But as I sat again beside Weber, I knew this wasn't victory yet. The judge still had to decide, and blood had a way of clouding truth. The gavel struck to adjourn for deliberation, and the echo followed me out of the courtroom, like a shadow that refused to lift. The judge returned to the bench after what felt like a lifetime of waiting. His robe trailed slightly as he sat, the quiet in the room so complete I could hear my own breath. He shuffled papers, cleared his throat, and then looked directly at me before addressing the court. After reviewing testimony, witness statements, and medical evaluations, this court finds no evidence of mental decline or incompetence in Mrs. Renata Calder, he began. His tone was steady, not cold, but absolute. On the contrary, records demonstrate she has managed her finances responsibly, with clarity and prudence. The petition for guardianship is hereby denied. The gavel struck once sharp as a thunderclap, and my body released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My knees threatened to buckle, but Mr. Weber's steady hand on my arm kept me upright. The judge continued, his gaze shifting toward Leora and Ewan. Furthermore, it is the opinion of this court that the petition was financially motivated, not born of genuine concern for Mrs. Calder's welfare. Let this serve as notice: this courtroom will not be used to enable exploitation. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Leora sat frozen, her face drained of its performance veneer. Ewan's jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch in his cheek. Their lawyer scribbled something furiously, but even he looked defeated. I stood tall as the bailiff announced the case dismissed. My legs carried me out of the courtroom with more strength than I thought I had left. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking. I wasn't the one explaining myself. I was walking out with my dignity intact. But the victory air chilled as soon as we stepped outside. The courthouse steps gleamed in the weak Oregon sun, and there, just out of the judge's sight, Leora's mask dropped. She moved close enough for only me to hear her words slicing through the bustle of the crowd. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice stripped of sweetness, nothing left but venom. "Don't think you've won. You're old and will outlast you." For a moment, my throat closed, but then the words struck a different chord. They weren't prophecy, they were desperation. Still, I met her eyes steady. "Not today, Leora." Her sneer deepened before Ewan pulled her away, muttering something about better options. I watched them disappear into the crowd, their backs stiff with fury. Mr. Weber walked beside me to the car. "They'll lick their wounds, but I don't believe they're finished," he said softly. "You need to remain careful. They may change tactics." I nodded, my purse heavy with the papers that now felt less like defense and more like a weapon I had finally learned to wield. Justice had spoken, but so had Leora, and her threat lingered longer than the judge's words. Still, as I sat in the driver's seat, I let myself savor the smallest victory. The weight of being judged incompetent, unfit, invisible, it had been lifted. I was still me. My mind was sharp, my choices intact, my independence intact. Yet freedom has its own burden. I knew the war wasn't over. They had lost in the courtroom, but battles don't always end where gavels fall. I started the engine, the courthouse shrinking in my rearview mirror, and told myself I would rest when the time was right, but not now. Not yet, because shadows still trailed me, and I could already sense the next blow waiting just beyond the horizon. The days after the hearing felt lighter, as though a band around my chest had finally loosened. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about what I wanted, not what Leora needed, not what Ewan demanded. Just me. On Tuesday, I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. I'd always admired the soft bleed of colors, the way water carried pigment into shapes that looked like dreams. My first attempt was clumsy, but when the instructor leaned over and said, "You have an eye for light," I smiled in a way I hadn't in months. My hands, once busy writing checks and signing transfers, now moved brushes across paper, and it felt like creation, not loss. Later that week, I treated myself to dinner at a small bistro near downtown. I chose a corner table by the window, the kind of spot Robert used to love because it let him watch the street. The waiter set a single plate before me, roast chicken with lemon and thyme. Eating alone, I realized, didn't mean being lonely. Each bite was mine, unshared, unresented, untouched by guilt. The wine glass caught the light, and for once I toasted myself. But peace has a fragile edge. As I lingered over dessert, the hum of conversation around me shifted, and a voice at the next table pricked my ears. "She says her mom cries if she doesn't help a young woman," laughed, her tone cruel in its casualness. "Just wait, she'll give in, she always does." The words froze me. I kept my head low, but my pulse quickened. It was one of Leora's friends. I recognized her from the wedding photos, standing proudly in that hall I was never invited to. She complains, sure, the friend continued swirling her drink, but money always shows up. Ewan says it's just a matter of pushing her buttons. She caves. Every time. My fork stilled above the empty plate. They were mocking me. My love, my sacrifices, my desperate hope for closeness, all reduced to a joke shared over cocktails. The image of myself as they saw me weak, predictable, a faucet they could turn on at will, burned hotter than shame. I set the fork down quietly and pressed a napkin to my lips, though no food remained. My cheeks were warm, but my heart had gone cold. Tears didn't come this time. Anger did. They thought they knew me. They thought the pattern would never break, that I'd keep opening my wallet the way I once opened my arms. But what they didn't know was that something had shifted in the courtroom. The judge had called their motives what they were, financial. He had given me back my name, and I was done letting it be laughed at across restaurant tables. I paid the bill without finishing my dessert. As I walked past the table, the young woman's laughter rang out again, sharp and hollow. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any outburst. Outside, the evening air was crisp and the city lights shimmered against the river. I drew in a breath, steady and strong. They could laugh, they could scheme, but they would never see me crumble again. Because now I understood their cruelty wasn't my weakness. It was my fuel. And as I walked toward my car, I knew the next step would not be about surviving them. It would be about building a life entirely free of them. It had been nearly 3 months since I overheard that cruel laughter in the bistro. In that time, I had built small rituals that were mine alone, morning walks along the river watercolor, afternoons dinners with Eleanor, where we traded stories instead of grievances. The phone had been quiet, blissfully so, until one rainy Thursday morning when it rang with Leora's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. But something in me said to answer. Mom. Her voice was raw, none of its usual polish. Please, please don't hang up. I didn't. I waited. The rent's overdue. 2 months now. Ewan's out of work and I can't cover everything. The landlord's threatening eviction. We don't know what to do. Her words tumbled, desperate, stripped of performance. I leaned against the counter, staring at the raindrops racing down the window. I'm sorry to hear that, I said softly. Can you help us just this once? Just until Ewan finds something. Please. The old me would have already been reaching for my checkbook, rearranging my life to save hers. But the new me had learned that rescue was not the same as love. I can't give you money, I said, but I can give you something better. There's a cafe downtown hiring full-time. I'll text you the number. And the community center offers budgeting workshops free every Saturday. There was a silence so sharp, I thought the line had gone dead. Then her voice came back, but it wasn't pleading anymore. It was venom. You're unbelievable, she spat. I come to you humiliated, begging for help, and you hand me job listings, budgeting classes. Do you know how cruel that is? Her words pierced, but I didn't flinch. I steadied my voice. Cruelty is paying for a life I'm not allowed to live in. Cruelty is financing a wedding I wasn't invited to. Cruelty is calling me only when you need me. On the other end, her breathing turned ragged, furious. You'll regret this, she said again, the same phrase she'd hurled on the courthouse steps. No, I replied calmly. I regret the years I said yes when I should have said no. The line went dead, her anger cutting it short. I stood there with the phone still warm in my hand, feeling the ache of finality settle in. Outside, the rain eased a thin beam of sunlight breaking through the gray. I set the phone down and picked up my brushes. Because life was waiting, and it was mine to paint. But deep down, I knew her desperation wouldn't vanish with one call, and the storm she carried would find its way back to my door. The community center smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint, the kind of place where people gather to start over. I had signed up to attend a discussion group, but somehow I found myself at the front of the circle, the chairs arranged loosely, faces turned toward me. My palms were damp. Yet, when I looked at Eleanor sitting nearby with her steady smile, I felt rooted. We're here, I began, because each of us has been told that love means sacrifice. But sometimes what they call love is really just taking. A murmur of agreement passed through the room. There were a dozen of us widows retirees, grandparents each carrying stories that looked different on the surface, but echoed the same refrain underneath. Eleanor spoke first. "My son took my car," she said plainly. "Said he'd return it when he could afford his own." 3 years later, I was still walking to the grocery store while he drove past me on the highway. Her laugh was brittle, but her eyes held strength. Another woman, Delia, lifted her hand. My granddaughter charged her college tuition to my account without asking. When I confronted her, she told me if I loved her, I wouldn't care about the money. Heads nodded. Sighs filled the air. And for a moment, I thought I could see invisible threads weaving between us, strands of recognition, binding us together. I told my own story carefully. About the rent payments, the car loans, the endless deposits. About the wedding I never attended. About the phrase, "only special people." And when I finished, there was silence, not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of people who knew too well the shape of that wound. An older man named Arturo finally said, "They make us feel small so they can feel big." But we're not small. We're standing here. Something in me loosened at his words. I looked around the circle and saw not victims but survivors, each of us, holding both scars and resilience. We've been told that saying no is cruel. I said, my voice firmer now. But what's cruel is being forced to choose between love and dignity. Real love doesn't demand that trade. What I've learned is simple, what love isn't. It isn't a transaction. It isn't silence. And it isn't fear. Eleanor reached for my hand, and others followed the circle, closing not in despair, but in solidarity. For the first time, I realized that my story wasn't just mine to carry. It was fuel, a lantern for others walking the same dark path. As the meeting ended, people lingered, exchanging numbers, promising to meet again. I stayed behind, stacking chairs, heart lighter than it had been in years. Healing, I understood now, wasn't meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. And as I locked the center's door and stepped into the cool Portland evening, I knew that sharing my strength was the only way to keep it alive for what was still to come. Spring came earlier than expected, soft rain coaxing new shoots through the soil outside my cottage. I found myself walking through each room, opening closets and drawers, taking inventory not of what I owned, but of what no longer belonged in my life. The storage unit in the garage still held furniture I had once bought for Leora, extra chairs, end tables, even a brand new mattress she'd sworn she needed, but never came to collect. For years, I kept it all as though waiting for her to claim not just the objects, but the bond they represented. Now I knew better. I called a second-hand dealer, and by the weekend, a truck came to haul it away. Watching the pieces vanish, I didn't feel loss. I felt space opening, air returning. When the man handed me the envelope of cash, I already knew where it would go. The next meeting of the Elder Boundaries Circle. I laid the money on the table. This is our fund, I told them. For coffee, for flyers, for anyone who needs a ride here. It was spent once on silence. Now it can be spent on voices. The smiles around the circle were worth more than any interest that money could have earned. Back home, I turned my attention to the garden. Robert had once planted roses along the fence, their blooms deep crimson. Over time, neglect and grief had left them spindly, nearly bare. That spring, I dug in the soil, pruning back the dead stems, planting new bushes in soft pink and golden yellow. My hands were blistered, my knees sore, but each thorn and petal felt like a prayer. When the first blossoms opened, I stood at the gate, breathing in their fragrance. The garden no longer felt like a hiding place. It was a threshold, a symbol of something I had almost forgotten. I could have a life built on respect, not demands. I walked to the porch, unlocked the door, and set the spare key gently on the table inside. Not for Leora, not for Ewan, not for anyone who saw me as a resource. This time the key was for those who understood the rule I had learned too late, but not too late to live by. I still keep a spare key, respect first, entry second. Outline main character Renata Calder, 66, retired literature teacher, widowed. Lives in Portland, Oregon. Known for her roses and quiet resilience. Word count 600. Renata calls her daughter Leora to ask about the wedding date. Leora casually replies, "We got married yesterday. Only special people were invited." Renata is stunned. Twist, after the call. Renata sees photos online, lavish banquet, at the exact venue she had put a deposit on months ago, believing it was reserved for her daughter's future wedding. Her money financed her own exclusion. Setting Renata's modest craftsman-style home with lilac dress and shoes still in her closet. Hook. Question. How would you feel if the money you gave in love became the ticket to your own humiliation? Word count 600. Flashback, Renata recalls. 3 years of sacrifices, paying $700 monthly toward rent, covering car repairs, groceries, even medical emergencies. She remembers canceling her own book club trips to save money for Leora. Introduces son-in-law Ewan, always evasive around her. Setting Portland Farmers Market, where Renata once skipped buying flowers for herself to buy them groceries. Hook. Question. When generosity becomes expectation, is it still love or just a transaction? Word count 650. Renata visits their apartment in Portland's Pearl District. Sees framed wedding photos, Leora in a $4,000 gown, Ewan's parents in tuxedos. She notices a chair she had bought for them, but no photo includes her. Ewan avoids her eyes. Leora plays host like a queen, setting their sleek loft contrasted with Renata's homely cottage. Hook. Question. What hurts more, being forgotten or being erased deliberately? Word count 600. 1 week later, Leora calls with feigned sweetness. "Mom, the rent is overdue. Did you transfer it?" Renata pauses, breath steady, and replies, "Didn't I tell you I only help special people?" The silence is cutting. This is Renata's first act of defiance. Hook. Question. If someone calls you only when they need money, what would you say the next time? Word count 700. Renata sits with checkbooks, receipts, and calculates over $33,000 given in 3 years. She cries, but this time with anger, not sorrow. Cancels automatic transfers at the bank. Banker Mr. Klein expresses concern more genuine than her daughter's. Setting bank branch with Mr. Klein, who has known her transactions for years. Hook. Question. When you finally count the cost of love, do you still call it love or debt? Word count 650. Renata changes her locks. Locksmith discovers multiple duplicate copies had been made of her spare key. Disturbing twist, Leora had preemptively prepared to always have access. Neighbor Eleanor Brooks, 70, brings cookies, comforts her, and shares her own story of being used by her child. Setting Renata's front porch with roses, evening shadows. Hook. Question. What does it mean when your child copies your key, protection, or possession? Word count 650. Leora and Ewan arrive angry. Accuse Renata of confusion and paranoia. They hint at bringing in professionals to check on her mental health. Renata calmly refuses to let them inside. Ewan says, "We'll make sure you're safe one way or another." Ominous foreshadowing. Hook. Question. When love turns into threats, is silence still an option? Word count 600. A social worker, Mrs. Schmidt, visits after a concerned family report. Twist report claims Renata is paranoid, isolating herself, installing unnecessary security. Her attorney, Mr. Weber, arrives and shuts down the false report. Schmidt leaves uneasy, realizing she was misled. Hook. Question. What would you do if your own child tried to paint you as insane? Word count 700. Renata visits her late husband's grave. Twist. She learns from cemetery staff that Leora used her late father's life insurance policy as collateral for a loan without permission. Betrayal deepens financial and spiritual theft. Setting Greenwood Cemetery outside Portland. Hook. Question. How do you forgive someone who robs both your wallet and your memories? Word count 600. Weber advises Renata secure accounts. Adjust will designate neutral fiduciary. Renata feels empowered, though weary. Setting Weber's law office full of leather-bound books. Hook, question. When paper becomes your shield, can it protect a heart as well as a bank account? Word count 650. Leora files for guardianship claiming mental decline. Witnesses hostile neighbor Mr. Davis bribed pharmacist Mr. Green and Leora's testimony. Twist fabricated psychiatric report claims Renata is unfit. Setting Multnomah County Courthouse. Hook, question. If your own child drags you to court, who will the world believe, blood or truth? Word, count 600. Weber cross-examines Leora. When's the last time you called without asking for money? She stumbles. Ewan falters when asked why they broke into Renata's home. Renata presents pristine records and undergoes independent evaluation scoring above average. The phrase special people is quoted back in court, leaving the judge visibly disturbed. Hook, question. Can cold, hard evidence ever heal a wound made by blood? Word count 600. Judge rules against guardianship. Calls case financially motivated. Outside, Leora sneers. You'll regret this. Renata feels liberated but senses the war isn't over. Hook, question. When justice is on your side, can you finally rest or must you stay vigilant? Word count 600. Renata reclaims her life, attends a watercolor class, eats alone at a bistro, enjoys freedom. Twist overhears one of Leora's friends bragging. She says her mom cries if she doesn't help, just wait, and she'll give in. This cruelty strengthens her resolve. Hook, question. Would you keep giving, knowing they laugh behind your back? Word count 500. Months later, Leora calls genuinely desperate. Rent unpaid, Ewan jobless. Renata listens but refuses money, instead giving job leads budgeting tools. Twist, Leora explodes, accusing her of cruelty. Renata cruelty is paying for a life I'm not allowed to live in. Hook, question. Is true love saying yes or having the courage to say no? Word count 500. Renata hosts a circle at the community center for elders who faced financial abuse. Eleanor and others share their stories. She realizes her strength can protect others. Setting Portland Community Center. Hook, question. When you find healing, do you keep it for yourself or pass it on? Word count 500. Renata sells off storage furniture. She once bought for Leora, uses money to fund Elder Boundaries Circle. Plants roses at home, symbolic rebirth. Closing line. I still keep a spare key, respect first entry. Second. Setting her cottage garden roses blooming. Hook. Question, final. When respect finally knocks, do you savor it alone or open the gate to the world?